Getting back into training after injury or illness can be an incredibly frustrating process. But the really important thing to understand and to appreciate is that often it's much more important that you give yourself extra time to recover and get ready to go, rather than coming back too early and either falling back into illness or re-injuring yourself or just hindering that process of recovery. It's one of the hardest things to do, particularly for triathletes or kind of very keen cyclists. It's what they love, and so they just want to get back into it. And so having that level of emotional intelligence is probably one of the biggest factors towards coming back and performing at similar level again. You'll instinctively know, really, as to whether you're ready to train or not. And generally speaking, the rule that we set our athletes is, if you're umming and ahhing about it, you're probably still not ready. We are very instinctive animals, and we're very, I think, in tune when we want to be with how our bodies are feeling, and use that. And that's what we talk about when it comes to emotional intelligence. With injury, obviously be led by your physios or doctors. And I think the particular thing to recognise is that when it comes to soft tissue damage in particular, soft tissue has a very poor blood supply and is incredibly slow to repair. Okay, so if you are suffering a soft tissue injury, you have to manage your expectations in terms of what you can do when you come back into training. Okay, if it's, I don't know, a ligament in your knee, etc., lots of changing of direction and things like that, they're just not going to be comfortable for you, and you don't really want to test the boundaries. When you're coming back into training, you do have to build into it. And again, I think that's another source of frustration for many athletes, is that building process and acknowledging how slow soft tissue is to kind of adapt. It's almost like starting again, I guess, but you do have to really build it up in incremental stages. The alternative is you go too hard, too soon, and re-injure yourself. When it comes to illness, we give our athletes a 3-day rule, 3-day reintroduction to training. So firstly, they need to be convinced that they're ready to go back to training. But on the first day, they're allowed to do 30 minutes, zero intensity, really cruisy, and no more than that. On the second day, they're still limited to around 45 minutes, and they're allowed to pick up the pace ever so slightly. It's still very much low intensity. On the third day, they're then allowed to introduce a little bit of intensity, just some short bursts, and just seeing how the body responds. If after those 3 days they have no issues, then they can start to think about coming back into normal-ish training, still intending on keeping the intensity relatively low. But if they have any kind of reaction, they basically have to go back to the start. And that, in our experience, is a pretty kind of useful way of keeping the ego in check. Nonetheless, I think even if you are struggling with injury or illness, there is almost always something you can do. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying if you've got a broken leg, you can always run to some degree. There's some stuff you're not going to be able to do, but it's about being a little bit innovative, thinking outside the box as to what you can do. So, just an example, with some of our athletes, when they're coming back from injury, say like a shoulder injury or something, we can still get them maintaining a certain level of cardiovascular training, either through a recumbent bike, or if it's not painful to do so, a elliptical trainer, something like that, something where there's very little jolting, very little impact. And when it comes to trying to do something rather than nothing, we're talking about trying to stay active rather than trying to maintain training, generally speaking. So there you go, there's just a little bit of advice when it comes to returning back to training after illness or injury.